Whoever tries to please everyone gets lost in everyone. Whoever learns to preserve themselves discovers that true power is born from the selfishness that builds, not from the kindness that consumes. From a young age, you've been taught that being good is synonymous with self-sacrifice. School, family, religion, and culture itself tirelessly repeat that the most virtuous person is one who gives of himself, who puts others above himself. It seems noble, it seems lofty, it seems the right path. But what if I told you that this narrative, portrayed as virtue, is nothing more than a strategy of control? What if I revealed to you that those who most preach unconditional altruism are precisely those who benefit most from docile, submissive, and altruistic people? This is the first breakthrough Machiavelli invites us to make, to see that the myth of universal altruism is not a path to greatness, but to servitude. Those who live only to serve inevitably become hostages to those who live for themselves. History is full of examples demonstrating how excessive kindness opens the door to exploitation. Generous kings were overthrown by the very subjects they sought to please. Benevolent leaders were betrayed by those to whom they had sworn loyalty. Ordinary people who dedicated their lives to others often end up forgotten, exhausted, invisible. The paradox is brutal. The more you sacrifice, the more the world demands of you. The more you give, the less you are worth. The altruist believes he is loved, but the love born of submission is always conditional, always fragile, always ready to vanish the moment one stops giving. And if love disappears when one stops sacrificing, was it truly love or just convenience? The Machiavellian view is uncomfortable because it strips away the mask of hypocritical morality. For Machiavelli, human nature is driven by self-interest. Each person thinks first of themselves, even when pretending to think of the community. Selfless kindness exists only in words, never in practice. And those who don't understand this truth become easy prey for those who do. How many times have you found yourself saying yes when you meant no, just to avoid appearing selfish? How many times have you silently repressed yourself, hoping others would recognize your efforts, only to find that no one noticed? How many times have you given beyond your limits, believing you would be remembered, only to be rightfully forgotten in the end? Such is the fate of those who believe in the myth of altruism, giving until you have nothing left, and still receiving nothing in return. But what happens when you start questioning this pattern? What happens when you realize that unconditional kindness doesn't protect you, but weakens you? An inner unease arises, because everything around you tries to convince you otherwise. Culture repeats that being selfish is a sin, a flaw, a moral failing. But Machiavelli would overturn this logic. Selfishness isn't a flaw, it's a self-preservation instinct. It's the only way to avoid being devoured in a world where everyone, secretly, is looking out for their own interests. Selfishness is the courage to admit what everyone feels, but few have the strength to confess that no one survives by always putting others first. This is where reflection becomes more difficult. Why do you feel you always have to justify yourself when you decide to prioritize yourself? Why do you feel guilty when you say no to a request you don't want to fulfill? Why do you feel obligated to carry burdens that aren't yours? The answer is simple. Because you've been trained to do so. Trained to believe that altruism is an absolute virtue, while selfishness is an unforgivable flaw. Trained to serve, never to govern. But if you look closely, you'll see that those who govern, those who give orders, those who make the rules, have never been altruistic. They've always taken care of themselves first, and only others afterwards, when it suited them. The trap is believing that altruism brings respect, when in reality it only leads to exploitation. The altruist is seen as a resource, not a leader. He is admired in theory, but despised in practice. People praise his kindness even as they take advantage of it, but they rarely reciprocate. It's cruel, but true. The world doesn't respect those who are always willing to sacrifice themselves. The world respects those who know how to set limits, those who put their own survival before external demands, those who don't bow to emotional pressure. In other words, the world respects selfish people. And here the inevitable question arises. Do you truly live for yourself, or just to be accepted by others? Is your kindness a choice or a fear of rejection? Is your altruism a virtue, or just an inability to deal with disapproval? Machiavelli would say that until you learn to put yourself first, you will never be free. You will always be a pawn in someone else's game, never a player. You will always be part of someone else's plan, never the author of your own strategy. Look around you and realize, those celebrated as good are often forgotten, while those criticized as selfish end up staying in power. The altruistic are consumed until they're left with nothing. The selfish survive, thrive, and rule. It's not a question of morality, it's a question of reality. If everyone takes care of themselves, why should you be the only exception? Why should you be the only exception? Who benefits? The answer is clear. Whoever benefits from your sacrifice is the one who wins. Unbridled altruism is not a virtue, it's a tool to keep some strong and many weak, a tool to make you accept less than you deserve, a tool to keep you silent while others amass power. The Machiavellian vision, though harsh, is liberating, because when you accept that you must be selfish, you free yourself from the need for approval. You stop justifying yourself, you stop begging for recognition, you stop expecting gratitude. You understand that your first responsibility is to yourself, and that only then can you offer something authentic to the world. Altruism may seem nice, but it is selfishness that builds protective walls, that preserves your energy, that guarantees your survival. What if you chose, from now on, to stop apologizing for putting yourself first? What if you accepted that your life isn't meant to be lived as a resource for others, but as a path to your own greatness? You might be accused of being selfish, but would that really be an insult? Or would it be the greatest compliment you could receive? This is the beginning of the journey, understanding that the myth of altruism was created to keep you tied to invisible chains, and that only by embracing strategic selfishness can you begin to free yourself from it. From this point on, the question is no longer whether selfishness is right or wrong. The question is, are you willing to be strong enough to embrace what everyone feels, but few have the courage to experience? Most people spend their lives believing that living for others is a virtue, and that protecting oneself is a sign of reprehensible selfishness. But Machiavelli, with the coldness of one who analyzes men and kingdoms like pieces on a chessboard, would argue that the first duty of every individual is to preserve himself. Altruism may be applauded in speeches, but it is self-preservation that guarantees survival. Those who give without limits quickly become prey, and those who don't understand this end up exhausted, invisible, and expendable. It's hard to admit, but no one cares for you the way you should care for yourself. And if you don't protect yourself, you can't expect the world to. The world drains, demands, consumes, demands ever more, without ever giving anything back. Think about how many times you've given in to something you didn't want. How many times you've said yes when your will screamed no. How many times you've sacrificed yourself for someone who didn't even remember the effort you'd made. Maybe you stayed up all night trying to help. Maybe you spent money you didn't have. Maybe you wasted energy on causes that weren't yours. And what's left? Often just exhaustion and silence. The world doesn't reward those who give up. It only learns to demand more. It's like feeding an animal that's never satisfied. The more you give, the more it comes back to devour what's left. Self-preservation isn't cheap selfishness. It's not gratuitous coldness. It's a survival instinct that must be consciously cultivated. Imagine a flame. If you use all your energy to warm others, sooner or later your light goes out. And when you extinguish it, who really gets warm? Who really cares if you've burned down to the last spark? Most of the time, no one. The silence after sacrifice is cruel but real. How many times have you seen someone who dedicated themselves to everyone end up forgotten, while those who lived for themselves remain standing? The real world works differently. In the workplace, for example, the employee who accepts every task, who silently sacrifices, who never says no, quickly becomes the repository of everything no one wants to do. They carry the burden of the entire team, but are rarely the most recognized. Often it's the one who dared to protect their burden, who said, "It's not my responsibility," who ends up getting promoted. Is this unfair? No. It's simply the reality of self-preservation. Those who protect themselves survive. Those who give themselves without filters burn out. And in personal relationships, how many times have you experienced or seen someone who has given everything for the other? The partner who is always forgiving, who accepts everything, who puts the needs of others before their own. At first, it seems noble. But over time, this excessive surrender doesn't generate respect. It generates contempt. Human beings, as Machiavelli understood, don't appreciate what is given without resistance. What is easy loses its luster. What is rare, what requires limits, what demands respect, is what remains desired. Self-preservation in this context isn't toughness, it's emotional intelligence. It's saying, I exist too, and my needs matter. But perhaps the most striking example is health. How many people literally get sick because they don't know how to protect themselves? The body screams, but the mind insists on saying yes to everything. Obligations pile up, time for themselves disappears, and before they know it, they're already physically and mentally exhausted. Self-preservation here isn't just a choice of power, but of life and death. Healthy selfishness is what makes you turn off your phone when you need to rest, decline an invitation when you need to recharge, prioritize health when everyone seems to demand sacrifices. Without it, collapse is inevitable. Why do we feel guilty about preserving ourselves? Because we were raised to do so. From childhood, we were shaped by the idea that thinking about ourselves is a sin, that saying no is an insult, that protecting ourselves is a betrayal. But Machiavelli would tear away this mask and ask, what virtue is there in destroying oneself? What merit is there in being generous to the point of self-destruction? The prince who gives too much of himself to the people loses his throne. The man who surrenders too much to the opinions of others loses his freedom. The woman who lives only to please ends up forgetting who she is. And in the end, those who have received so much never give back. Self-preservation is also a game of mystery. When you don't give yourself completely, when you keep a part of yourself hidden, when you choose where to invest, you create a space of power. Others begin to respect you because they realize they don't have complete access. Mystery breeds fear, and fear is always more reliable than love, as Machiavelli taught. The selfish person doesn't need to be cruel, they just need to be selective. They know their energy isn't infinite, and that investing poorly condemns it to failure. This calculation creates an aura around them. They're not banal, they're not predictable, they're not overly accessible. They're someone who chooses, and those who choose govern. But there's an even more profound change. When you learn to preserve yourself, you discover that you can even give more to others, but consciously, because no one can offer what they don't have. The limitless altruist ends up feeling empty and ultimately resentful. The strategic egoist remains whole and therefore can give without destroying themselves. Self-preservation is what allows true generosity, because only those who remain strong can truly support others. The weak who sacrifice themselves die young. The strong who protect themselves survive and multiply. What if you started treating every decision as a matter of survival? What if instead of asking, "What will people think of me?" you asked, "Does this strengthen me or weaken me?" How many different choices would there be in your life? How many hours would you have saved if you'd had the courage to say no sooner? How much burnout would you have avoided if you'd set clear boundaries from the start? Maybe your whole story would have turned out differently. This is why self-preservation cannot be considered a flaw. It is the cornerstone of everything. Without it, nothing holds. A leader without self-preservation is a weak ruler. An individual without self-preservation is a body adrift. A life without self-preservation is an invitation to exploitation. Only the strategic egoist, who knows how to protect his strengths, is capable of remaining standing when all others have given up. This is the second step of the journey, understanding that your first responsibility is to yourself, and that only when you accept this truth can you begin to freely write your own story. Because those who don't protect themselves will inevitably be protected by others, and always with intentions that don't benefit you. What Machiavelli shows us is clear. If you don't put your own survival first, you will be used as a tool for the survival of someone smarter than you. The power of self-preservation is this: protecting yourself from exploitation and remaining whole in a world that consumes the naive. It's not harshness, it's intelligence. It's not cruelty, it's an instinct for greatness. And if there's anything that should be assimilated here, it's the certainty that taking care of yourself isn't just a right, it's a duty. Because only those who preserve themselves can grow. Only those who preserve themselves can lead. Only those who preserve themselves can truly choose their own destiny. From the moment we first open our eyes to the world, we are conditioned to seek the approval of others. A newborn cries and waits for comfort from its parents. A child shows a drawing and longs for a teacher's praise. A teenager dresses to fit in. An adult shapes their entire life to meet society's expectations. It's a cycle that seems natural, inevitable, but one that Machiavelli would dismantle with frightening coldness. The need for approval is not a virtue, it's a prison. Living to please is the quickest way to lose oneself, because one's identity is not determined by oneself, but by the eyes of others. This is where illusion proves dangerous, because approval is unstable, changeable, as volatile as the wind. Today you're praised, tomorrow criticized. Today they applaud you, tomorrow they stone you. The same audience that acclaims a hero is the one that demands your head when you don't like a detail. Approval is like building a house on quicksand. Nothing you build will have a solid foundation. Yet, thousands of people spend their entire lives trying to erect walls on this unstable ground, believing that one day they will find stability in the gaze of others. But does such stability exist? How many times have you found yourself thinking more about how you'd be perceived than what you really wanted to do? How many times wasn't your decision your own, but a reflection of fear of judgment? How many times have you been unable to express your thoughts not because you didn't believe them, but because you feared the reaction? If we're honest, we recognize that the pursuit of approval rules our lives far more than we're willing to admit. And what is this if not slavery disguised as virtue? What if the praise you crave is nothing more than a trap? What if every approval you receive is just the invisible leash keeping you trapped? Think about it. When someone tells you well done, you feel pleasure. But at the same time, you develop a need to hear it again. Now you act not just out of conviction, but to repeat the feeling. And every time you don't receive approval, you feel like you failed. Could this cycle be the cruelest prison? Machiavelli would say that a ruler who seeks to be loved loses power, because he becomes dependent on pleasing others. He may even get smiles, but he will never command obedience, because the love of the people is fickle, but the respect born of fear is solid. Translating this into everyday life, those who live to please are never taken seriously. The friend who never says no, the colleague who accepts everything, the partner who sacrifices to avoid displeasing, all these end up being seen as convenient, not as strong. What about you? Have you ever found yourself in this position without realizing it? Think about how many times you've been exploited precisely because you were afraid of disappointing. How many times you've worked twice as hard because you couldn't say no to a request. How many times you've taken on a blame you weren't responsible for just to maintain harmony. How many times you've been used because the other person knew you wouldn't dare displease them. Isn't that exactly how you enslave someone? Not with visible chains, but with the expectation of approval. What if you understood that true power begins when you stop begging for acceptance? What if the moment you bear the weight of judgment is the very moment you free yourself? This is the Machiavellian shift. Accepting being misunderstood, accepting being hated, accepting being unappreciated, because the freedom to be who you are is worth more than any applause. Are you ready for this shift? The illusion of approval also fuels another trap: constant comparison. You don't just seek acceptance, you seek to be more accepted than others. It's the invisible addiction to comparison that slowly erodes self-esteem. As long as you measure your worth through the eyes of others, there will always be someone more praised, more celebrated, more loved. And you'll live running a marathon without a finish line, believing victory is near but never quite reaching it. Isn't this the perfect game to keep people always tired, always running, always ready to give without ever asking themselves why they're running? Now imagine what happens when someone breaks this cycle, when a man or woman decides they no longer need acceptance, no longer need applause. The silence around that person changes. Others who previously exploited their need to please are shocked. The boss who always counted on your yes suddenly hears a no. The friend who always drained your energy finds you've backed away. The partner who counted on your submission realizes you've now set limits. Isn't it curious how respect emerges precisely when you stop begging for approval? What if the true root of respect lies not in love, but in rejection? How many times have you seen people who never made an effort to please others, yet, paradoxically, were the most respected? How many times have you seen those who never sought approval from others be the ones who received attention? What does this reveal about human nature? The greatest suspense of this revelation is realizing that approval is less about you and more about others. What others approve of you isn't who you are, but how well you serve their interests. Your colleague praises you for taking on a task they didn't want. Your partner appreciates you for giving up something you wanted. The audience applauds you for behaving exactly as they expected. But what happens when you change the rules of the game, when you stop serving the interests of others? Approval vanishes. Not because you are no longer valuable, but because you are no longer useful. Do you realize the gravity of all this? Do you understand that living for approval means living for the interests of others? Isn't it time to break this logic? Machiavelli would say that the wise prince never allows himself to be governed by the love of the people, because he knows that the same people who acclaim him today could destroy him tomorrow. Likewise, the wise man does not allow himself to be governed by approval. He receives it when it arrives, but does not depend on it. He loses it when it disappears, but remains unperturbed. He remains steadfast, guided not by an outsider's gaze, but by his own conviction. And it is this steadfastness, paradoxically, that makes even those who detest him respect him. What if you understood that the key to freedom lies in bearing the burden of being unloved? What if you accepted that living under judgment is the price of independence? How many invisible chains would fall from your body in that instant? The illusion of approval is simultaneously the sweetest and the most dangerous. Sweet because it brings the immediate pleasure of applause. Dangerous because it enslaves those who don't realize how dependent they have become. Breaking this illusion takes courage, but it opens the door to a kind of power most people will never know. The power to be whole, even when you're unloved. The power to be respected, even when you're hated. The power to be free, even when the world tries to imprison you with expectations. This is the third step of the journey, destroying the need to please and accepting the risk of disapproval. Because the moment you stop seeking acceptance, you discover you no longer need it. And in that instant, you become someone who can no longer be manipulated. Since the beginning of human history, people have been taught to value kindness as the supreme virtue. Religions have extolled unconditional love, traditions have celebrated those who sacrificed themselves for others, and popular culture has made heroes of those who gave their life to the very end. But harsh reality has always belied this narrative. The good rarely ruled, the kind rarely survived, and the altruistic almost always ended up crushed at the hands of those who never hesitated to put themselves first. It is at this point that Machiavelli, with his brutal clarity, reveals the contradiction. It is not kindness that keeps a man in power, but respect. And respect, in its most solid form, is born not of love, but of fear. Think for a moment about how you treat someone who always gives in, a coworker who never complains, who accepts everything, who goes out of their way to be kind. This is the kind of person we like in the short term, but ultimately don't take seriously. They become a useful resource, never a respected presence. Now think of someone who sets clear boundaries, who doesn't cave in to pressure, who isn't afraid to say no. This person may not be the most loved, but they inspire a kind of respect that others never earn. The certainty that they can't be manipulated, and it's this certainty that generates respect. Love is fickle. It changes with the wind. Respect, rooted in fear, is much harder to break. One of the most curious stories comes from the lives of rulers who sought to be excessively kind. In Florence, for example, there were leaders who sought to please the people with constant concessions. They reduced taxes, forgave debts, and relinquished authority in the name of popularity, and for a time they were loved. But this love lasted only until a crisis arose. When the very people who had benefited from it felt a lack of resolve, love turned to contempt, and rulers fell like broken puppets. The most feared princes, those who maintained discipline, imposed limits, and did not hesitate to punish, could even be hated, but they remained on the throne, not because they were loved, but because they were respected. And if you apply this reasoning to everyday life, you'll see how it repeats itself. The father who tries to be friends with his children, giving in to their every whim, ends up lacking authority. The teacher who seeks only to please the class, avoiding discipline, soon finds himself ridiculed. The boss who fears displeasing his employees loses leadership and becomes the target of manipulation. The partner who gives without restraint ceases to be admired and begins to be despised. It's not a question of malice, but of human nature. What is easy loses value. What is unlimited becomes banal. What doesn't command respect ends up being discarded. But why do we have so much difficulty accepting this truth? Perhaps because we've been shaped by discourses that glorify love as the universal solution. We believe that if we're good enough, If we give enough of ourselves, we'll be loved and protected. But Machiavelli shakes us from this illusion with a simple question. What's the point of being loved if that love vanishes at the first sign of crisis? Love is always conditional. It exists as long as the other receives something in return. Fear, on the other hand, is independent of another's will. It arises from the perception of one's own strength, one's steadfastness, and one's refusal to give in. What if you understood that being loved can make you vulnerable, but being respected makes you indestructible? How many situations in your life could have been different if instead of trying to please others, you had set boundaries? How many times have you been exploited because you believed that being appreciated was more important than being respected? There's an intriguing passage about the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus. He was remembered not for his kindness, but for his harshness. He maintained strict discipline, punished treason without hesitation, and ruled with a firm hand. The people didn't love him but feared him, and this fear sustained his authority during crises where other leaders would have been overthrown. He survived not because he was generous, but because he was ruthless. Love can inspire admiration, but fear sustains loyalty. On a personal level, this same pattern repeats itself on a smaller scale, but with a profound impact. How many times have you seen someone stay in a toxic relationship simply to avoid losing the other person's love? How many times have you remained silent in the face of injustice to preserve the image of someone who could approve or reject you? But what happens when you decide to break up, when you choose to assert yourself, when you demonstrate that you don't need the other person's acceptance? Initially, there may be shock, even anger, but over time, respect grows. Because those who don't dare give in demonstrate that they have self-control. The mystery of human nature is this: everyone claims to appreciate kindness, but deep down, they respect strength. This is why so many benevolent leaders are forgotten, while the resolute ones live on in the collective memory. Love inspires songs, but fear raises thrones. Love can warm hearts, but fear protects boundaries. Love can move, but fear ensures survival. And in the game of life, it is survival that defines who remains and who disappears. But does this mean we should abandon all forms of kindness? Not necessarily. Machiavelli never said a ruler should be cruel at all times. He argued that kindness can be useful, but only when chosen strategically, never when it's required by law. Being too kind means lowering one's guard. Being kind at the right time is strategic. Selfishness acts as a filter in this case. One gives only when kindness strengthens, never when it weakens. The altruist gives in because he feels obliged. The strategic egoist chooses to give in only when the outcome strengthens his position. What if you started applying this principle to your life right away? What if, instead of trying to please everyone, you accepted that many people don't like you and that this is irrelevant? What if, instead of seeking applause, you sought respect? Would your attitude change? Would you speak less to please and more to assert your presence? Would you stop being seen as convenient and start being seen as necessary? The suspense of this reflection lies in the realization that neutrality doesn't exist. Either you demand respect, or you're driven by the need to please. Either you build your authority, or you're exploited by kindness. The world doesn't reward those who live for others. It rewards those who know how to exceed expectations. And that's why, in the end, the choice is simple. Would you rather be loved and rejected, or respected and remembered? The unlikely stories that span history confirm this rule. Men and women who dared to set limits were first hated, then respected. Those who tried to please everyone were first applauded, then forgotten. The trajectory repeats itself, like an invisible law. And if you look at your life, you'll see that the moments when you gave your all without limits were precisely the moments when you were most ignored. Meanwhile, the moments when you preserved yourself, when you asserted yourself, when you chose yourself, were those that commanded the greatest respect. This is the uncomfortable truth. Respect comes from fear, not kindness. Kindness can be beautiful, but fear is useful. Kindness can move, but fear sustains. Kindness can open doors, but fear keeps them open. And only those who understand this can truly govern themselves and the world around them. This is the next step in the Machiavellian journey. And the question remains, are you willing to abandon the illusion of needing to be loved to finally earn what truly matters? The respect that never fades? There comes a point in the journey where selfishness ceases to be a mere defense against exploitation and becomes a weapon of expansion. So far, we've seen how to protect ourselves, how to assert ourselves, how to free ourselves from approval and earn respect. But now the game becomes bolder. Strategic selfishness isn't just the shield that keeps us standing, it's the compass that guides every step toward growth. It becomes not only a means of survival, but also a way to multiply our forces, to conquer territories, to shape our destiny with our own hands. And this is precisely where many fail, because they confuse selfishness with isolation, when in reality, it is intelligent selfishness that allows for alliances, as long as they all serve self-strengthening purposes. The world is a chessboard of interests, and each person is a player trying to move the pieces to their own advantage. The naive believe this chessboard is cooperative, that everyone unites for the common good. But the harsh truth is that each person protects, above all, their own survival. This doesn't mean that alliances don't exist, but that each alliance lasts only as long as it serves the parties involved. How many empires have fallen because they blindly trusted allies who switched sides at the crucial moment? How many friendships have ended when their interests no longer aligned? How many relationships have ended because one protected their own interests, while the other sacrificed themselves to the point of leaving nothing behind? What if we viewed every relationship as a strategic exchange, not to cruelly use others, but to understand that no one connects without expecting something in return? The naive altruist believes they can give without limits, and that this will generate eternal love. The strategic egoist understands that love also requires balance, exchange, and mutual interest. It's not coldness, it's realism. Those who give everything without filters will inevitably be drained. Those who learn to give with moderation build solid relationships because they establish the silent rule that they won't be used. This is the turning point, when you realize that selfishness doesn't isolate you, but gives you the clarity to choose where to invest. It's selfishness that makes you reject invitations that add nothing to you. It's selfishness that prevents you from accepting tasks that only drain your energy. It's selfishness that makes you choose friends who elevate your life instead of draining your strength. And the consequence is inevitable. Instead of wasting energy everywhere, you focus on a few points, and each point expands with much greater force. This is the logic of strategic growth. How many opportunities have you missed because you were too busy pleasing those who didn't deserve it? How many times have you failed to invest in yourself because you spent resources supporting someone who would never do the same for you? How many of your projects have been shelved because you devoted yourself to someone else's dream? This is the price of blind altruism, sacrificing what could be great to support what will never be more than small. Selfishness, in this sense, is the key to redeeming everything that has been set aside. There's an inevitable tension when you start acting selfishly and selectively. Those around you, accustomed to benefiting from your generosity, will react. They'll accuse you of coldness, call you selfish in the most derogatory tone possible, and try to force you back into slavery. But realize the paradox. The more resistance you encounter, the more it reveals that you're on the right path. Those who lose privileges always complain. Those who stop exploiting always protest. The noise you hear when you assert yourself isn't a sign of error, but of liberation. What if that noise was actually proof that you're growing up? What if every accusation of selfishness was simply a reflection of others' fear of losing control over you? Have you ever considered that ultimately those who accuse you aren't interested in morality, but in convenience? History is full of examples of men and women who used selfishness as a growth strategy. Entrepreneurs who rejected illusory partnerships to invest alone and build empires. Leaders who prioritized their strengths before embarking on collective causes, ensuring stability before expanding. Even artists who protected themselves from excessive exposure to maintain their originality, refusing to please everyone to preserve the power of their work. In all cases, the rule repeats itself. Those who don't protect themselves first will never contribute anything of value to the world. But here's an unexpected twist. Strategic selfishness doesn't just protect, it multiplies. Because when you direct your energy only toward what truly matters, the results amplify. Imagine a river. When the water pours into 1,000 channels, it weakens and disappears into the ground. But when it concentrates in a single channel, it clears paths, moves rocks, and transforms the landscape. This is human energy. The altruist disperses and gets lost. The selfish concentrates and transforms. This is the difference between a banal life and a life of impact. What if you started measuring every decision today by the value it brings? What if every yes were given only when it brings strength? What if every no were a silent declaration that your energy is worth more than mere approval? Perhaps soon you'll notice your social circle shrinking, but your strength growing. Perhaps you'll realize that your life is becoming lonelier in appearance, but much richer in substance. Because in the end, what matters is not how many applaud you, but what you build with the few who truly matter. The suspense of this journey lies in realizing that the more you protect yourself, the more the world begins to seek you out. The altruist pursues you, begs for recognition, and offers himself as a resource. The strategic egoist attracts because his attitude conveys value. Everyone wants to get close to someone who doesn't give up easily. Everyone respects what isn't accessible to everyone, and this respect turns into power. Tension builds when you realize that growing up requires difficult choices. You'll have to turn down invitations, burn ties, and set boundaries. This creates discomfort, but it also brings clarity. The burden of supporting others fades, and you finally have the energy to support yourself, and that's when life begins to transform. Because instead of spending years supporting other people's plans, you begin to build your own empire. What if the real reason you haven't gotten what you want is excessive altruism? What if what you call kindness is nothing more than fear in disguise? Fear of being judged, fear of rejection, fear of being seen as selfish. How long will you allow this fear to decide for you? Growth requires selfishness because the world is a power struggle. Those who don't protect their own strengths are consumed by the strengths of others. Those who don't choose their own battles end up fighting someone else's war. Those who don't conserve their own energy end up spending every last drop on causes that yield nothing in return. The altruist may be praised, but it's the strategic, selfish one who endures. Because in the end, it's not the one who pleases most who wins, but the one who preserves himself most for growth. This is the fifth stage of the journey, the moment when you stop defending yourself simply to survive and begin using selfishness as an engine of expansion. The moment when every decision is measured by its return, every relationship by its balance, every action by its ability to strengthen your position. It is a difficult path because it requires abandoning the desire to please, but it is also the only one that leads to true growth. And when this awareness dawns, the inevitable expectation arises. What's the next step? If selfishness has allowed you to survive, gain respect, and grow, what is the pinnacle of this transformation? What happens when you no longer need to prove anything to anyone because you've tirelessly built your strength? This is precisely what the final part of the journey will reveal. The birth of the sovereign self, the relentless warrior who no longer seeks love or fears hatred because he has built the only thing that matters: absolute independence. We've reached the point where all the pieces fit together. After questioning the myth of altruism, learning to preserve ourselves, freeing ourselves from the illusion of approval, earning respect, and using selfishness as a growth strategy, there's only one step left: becoming our own sovereign. This is the pinnacle of the journey, the point where we're no longer controlled by other people's expectations, no longer manipulated by praise or insults, no longer needing anyone's approval to exist. Self-sovereignty is one who neither begs for love nor fears hate, because we've built such a stronghold around ourselves that nothing external defines who we are. This state doesn't mean cold isolation, but complete freedom. It's the ability to live according to our essence, guided by conscious choices, rather than living like a puppet pulled by invisible chains. This path may seem distant, but it begins with small daily decisions. It's when you reject what doesn't add up. It's when you choose yourself in the face of pressure to please. It's when you endure the weight of criticism, because you know you don't need the acceptance of those who don't carry the burden of your life. These choices shape the attitude that transforms an ordinary individual into someone ruthless, someone who demands silent respect without needing to beg for it. It's not the absence of feelings that creates the sovereign, but the mastery over them. It's not the lack of challenges that defines them, but the ability to transform every challenge into fuel. But what does it mean, in practice, to live sovereignly over oneself? It means choosing your relationships, rather than being chosen by them. It means committing to what strengthens your life, rather than getting lost in battles that aren't yours. It means using selfishness not as an excuse for indifference, but as a filter to live intensely only what matters. When you do this, you discover that you don't need crowds around you. A few people by your side are enough as long as you are whole. You discover that you don't need to prove anything to anyone, because the only proof that matters is the clarity of being in control of your story. What if you accepted that the price of freedom is the courage to be misunderstood? How many invisible chains would be broken in that instant? How many hours of your life would be regained if you stopped explaining yourself? How many paths would open up if you started choosing for yourself, instead of letting others choose for you? This is the first practical lesson: living without asking permission. It's not about being hostile, but about accepting that your life is yours and that no one has the right to decide for you. The second practical lesson is to cultivate strategic silence. It's not necessary to react to everything. It's not necessary to respond to everyone. It's not necessary to exhaust oneself in every battle. The sovereign is not the one who speaks the most, but the one who speaks at the right time. He doesn't waste words justifying himself, because he knows that every misplaced explanation is a weapon handed to the enemy. Instead, he observes, calculates, and intervenes only when the impact is inevitable. This mastery of silence creates an aura of power that no excess of words could generate. The third lesson is learning to transform every offense into growth. The sovereign does not fear insults, because he knows they reveal more about the one who utters them than the one who receives them. Every criticism is analyzed coldly. If it contains truth, it is used as a tool for evolution. If it is merely venom, it is discarded without penetrating the mind. Thus, nothing is lost. Even attacks become springboards. Even enemies work, unknowingly, to strengthen those who remain unshaken. The fourth lesson is to preserve energy as you would a treasure. Don't waste it on pointless discussions. Don't invest in those who drain you. Don't waste energy on causes that yield no results. Every action is considered an investment. Every gesture is calculated to strengthen one's position, rather than weaken it. This discipline creates coherence. The ruler is not guided by impulse, but by strategy. The fifth lesson is to accept solitude as part of the journey. The world is full of people who prefer the comfort of approval to the harshness of independence. When you choose to rise above this, you inevitably lose a part of the crowd, but the emptiness that feels like loneliness transforms into clarity. It is in this space that you find yourself, without noise, without pressure, without masks. It is in this space that inner strength is consolidated, because you no longer need an audience to validate your existence. And the final lesson is to understand that power is not domination over others, but self-mastery. The self-sovereign doesn't need to control anyone because he is no longer controlled. He becomes a point of reference not by imposing, but by inspiring. And this inspiration is more powerful than any speech because it comes from the living example of someone who has freed himself from invisible bonds. But are you ready to put all this into practice? Are you willing to endure disapproval, resignation, and initial discomfort? Are you ready to be labeled selfish, cold, and different? Because this is the barrier that separates the ordinary from the ruthless. Those who seek only to be loved never reach that point, but those who accept being misunderstood achieve the freedom everyone desires, but few have the courage to achieve. The ultimate impact of this journey lies not only in understanding Machiavelli, but in consciously living his teachings. It means observing every moment of pressure and asking, does this strengthen me or weaken me? It means analyzing every choice in light of real results, not illusory approval. It means accepting that being selfish, in a strategic sense, is not a sin, but a condition of survival. What if I started today? What if I decided right now to never again live as a pawn on someone else's chessboard, but as a player in your own game? What if, from now on, every decision was made not to please, but to strengthen your own strength? This is the invitation that remains. Don't wait for the perfect moment. The moment is now, because every second spent in the thrall of approval is a second wasted. Self-control isn't born ready. It's built with every choice, every silence, every imposed limit, every criticism turned into a springboard. It's forged in the fire of discipline, in the courage to give up, and in the audacity to rise above mediocrity. And the most surprising thing is that when you reach this point, you discover you don't have to prove anything to anyone. The simple act of remaining steadfast, relentless, and whole is already the greatest proof of power you can offer. This is the end of the journey. From here on, the responsibility is yours. You can continue to live to please. You can continue to sacrifice. You can maintain the invisible chains. Or you can decide to free yourself, preserve yourself, strengthen yourself, and become relentless. The choice is before you. And what you do now defines who you will be in the future. If you enjoyed this post, please like it now. Write in the comments, even anonymously, how you intend to apply these principles to your life starting today. Share your vision, because every word can inspire someone to undertake the same transformation. And above all, subscribe to the channel to continue this journey. This is just the beginning. Life doesn't wait. The journey to self-mastery begins now, and it starts with you.